Time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. All members of Parliament should agree that anyone who brings forward a sexual harassment complaint should be afforded confidentiality. Can the Prime Minister explain to the House the policy principles his government applies in protecting the confidentiality of people who bring forward sexual harassment complaints? Does the Prime Minister agree that no member of Parliament should publicly disclose the identity of people who make confidential sexual harassment complaints?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Of course I agree that complaints should be dealt with confidentially, and of course members of Parliament who are privy to those complaints should not disclose the identity of the complainant. Now, if the honourable member wishes to make an allegation against any member of Parliament, she should stand up and do so.
The member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's economic plan is creating jobs, supporting small and family businesses and reducing the burden on families, including in my electorate of Brisbane? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
Wow. The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right and the member for Jagga.
So, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And as the honourable member knows and has his constituents know in the electorate of Brisbane, the government's economic plan is delivering 403,000 jobs last year, the largest number of jobs created in our history. 16 consecutive months of jobs growth, 1,100 jobs a day last year. And we're delivering this because of our commitment to enterprise, to Australian business, to the incentives we've given to Australian family-owned businesses, small and medium businesses, to invest. And when they invest, you get more employment, you get more jobs. And now, Mr Speaker, we know that the opposition does not have a single policy to create one job. What we do know, well, I hear a note of dissent. We'd love to know what it is. They shouldn't keep it a secret. They should let us know what their plan is to create jobs, because they haven't shared it with anybody else. He wants to increase taxes on the very businesses that employ the majority of Australians in the private sector. That is, businesses where we have reduced taxes, businesses with turnovers up to $50 million a year. These are not huge corporate giants. These are not massive multinationals. These are overwhelmingly small and medium Australian family-owned businesses. They employ most of the private sector workforce. The Leader of the Opposition wants to put the tax up on those companies and those businesses, and we know what will happen is they'll invest less and they'll employ less. But, Mr Speaker, he has a plan for higher taxes, $165 billion, and we know that that will have the effect of reducing investment and employment. But it goes further than that. We've now seen him exposed doing the bidding of the CFMEU. In October last year, he told striking CFMEU workers that Australia's industrial relation laws were, and I use his terms, like a cancer, which is a remarkable description, given that these laws, the Fair Work Commission in particular and the Fair Work Act, were introduced by Labor. And what did he say about the Fair Work Commission at the time in December 2008? He said this legislation aims to create workplaces where our children will do better, not worse, than we used to, and which prosperity expands and embraces us all. Well, now he calls it a cancer, and speaking of children, he does this at the behest and in the presence of people who attacked workers who are going to work and said they would rape their children.
Members on my right. The member for Corangamite, the Treasurer. Members will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition will just pause for a second. I would like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon another Speaker, the Honourable Colin Brooks, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly from the Parliament of Victoria. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What is the average download speed for household connections on the Prime Minister's copper NBN?
Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can tell the honourable member that the vast majority of customers on the NBN, regardless of technology, buy products which are speed tiers of 25 megabits per second or less. And, Mr Speaker, I can say to the honourable member, that the rollout of the NBN, which is going at a pace never seen before in telecommunications history in Australia, is delivering years sooner, 6 to 8 years sooner, and tens of billions of dollars less. We're getting on with an NBN. We are activating more premises in a month than the Labor Party did in 6 years. The Labor Party can't manage an economy, they can't manage a business, and they certainly can't manage the construction of a giant project like the NBN.
The member for MACKELLAR.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer update the House on how the budget is delivering on the government's plan to reduce taxes on our economy? Is he aware of any alternative approaches and the implications of those approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for MACKELLAR
The member for Griffith
for his question.
Interjecting. She is warned.
The budget, Mr Speaker, has now been consistently projected to return to balance in 2021. That is now over 5 consecutive statements over the last 2 years. Within that budget, the tax cuts that are included in that budget have already been delivered for businesses with a turnover up to $50 million, and the budgeted extension of those tax cuts to all businesses in the economy is in that budget, and that is being done to drive the jobs and growth in our economy that we are seeing. More than 1,100 jobs created every single day last year, some 403,100 jobs. This side of the House, the Liberal and the National parties, are the parties of jobs. We're the parties of growth, Mr Speaker, and the Coalition's economic plan, it is being implemented, it is working, and we are getting on with it, and there's more to come, Mr Speaker. There is more to come on the Coalition's economic plan to drive growth. Now, there's a different approach that comes from those in the Labor Party. We learnt yesterday that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition was as good at economics as she was on geography, Mr Speaker. Now, normally that wouldn't be such a problem. But what we read today is that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition's left faction is the one now calling the tune, dictating the terms on economic policy in the Labor Party. That's what's happening. Now, Paul Keating and Bob Hawke would never have stood for that, Mr Speaker. They would have never have sat there and been dictated to by the left on economic policy. But this Leader of the Opposition, this shadow Treasurer, have been forced out there to recant all the things they used to believe, Mr Speaker. Now, the Leader of the Opposition today is worried that perhaps we might be following Trumponomics, he refers to it. Well, he's giving his shadow Treasurer very little credit, because in that great tome, Hearts and Minds, which I still have on
the Treasurer knows the rules on props.
Some months, no one else has come to borrow it, I should assure you.
Treasurer, resume his seat. Treasurer, resume his seat. Treasurer knows the rules on props. He's got a shocking history with them. He'll return to the dispatch box without it.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. But what he forgets is in that book, the shadow Treasurer said reducing company taxes promotes investment, creates jobs, drives growth. Perhaps President Trump read your book, Mr Speaker. The shadow Treasurer's book. He should be claiming more credit for these things. Perhaps he should. perhaps others should read it. Perhaps he should read it again, Mr Speaker, because this shadow treasurer has walked away from every conviction and belief he once held on the Australian economy. And he's sitting there while the Labor Party runs off to the almond latte left, Mr Speaker, taking their dictation from the left wing of the Labor Party. And when they're not doing that, they're taking their instructions from union thugs seeking their praises.
Members on both sides. The member for Greenway.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Last night at Senate estimates, the Prime Minister's department confirmed he has a 100 megabits per second NBN connection at his Point Piper mansion. Why does the Prime Minister get a 100 megabits NBN connection to his Point Piper mansion when 3/4 of premises on his copper NBN can't get that speed? Why is it always one rule for this born-to-rule Prime Minister and another for Australians?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there are 1.4 million premises in Australia which are able to get an NBN service on the hybrid fibre coax network built by Telstra and taken over by the NBN. 411,000 of them are active.
The member for Kingston is warned.
Thank you. And I just remind honourable members opposite, for example, the Leader of the Opposition in Avondale Heights, in his electorate, there are more than 2,000 premises connected to the NBN on the HFC. In the electorate of Watson, there's 2,000 premises electorate, and in the electorate of McMahon, there's 4,000 connected. All of those premises connected to HFC are able to get a 100 megabit per second product from the NBN, and in fact, if they were on the Telstra network, they should have been able to get a 100 megabit per second product before the NBN took over the network. The reality is, Mr Speaker, that 7.2 million homes and businesses are in areas where the NBN's been switched on. There are over 3.5 million premises currently connected. By 2020, Australia will be the first country of our size to make broadband access universal. Now, as I said in my earlier answer, Mr Speaker, we are connecting more premises a month than Labor did in 6 years. In fact, there were over 59,000 new active services in the past fortnight alone, compared to 51,000 in total under Labor. Now, we know what the Leader of the Opposition is trying to do. He's trying to run his politics of envy, his sort of faux class war. Of course,
Member for Gorton.
You should. Anyone that wants to know what a fake he is as a class warrior only has to watch the video of his address to the CFMEU workers at Oakey, Mr Speaker. There he is, Mr Speaker, the great imposter, complaining about an industrial relations system that he created, and doing everything he can to encourage the militancy of people that threaten violence, not just against other workers, but against their children. He has no shame, no principle, no character.
Just before I call the member for Denison, I'd also like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Australian Political Exchange Council's 12th delegation from the Philippines. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the NBN rollout is supposedly nearing a completion in Tasmania, but subcontractors in my electorate tell me the copper network, which is integral to your government's model, is in dire need of improvement. So why has the copper network improvement program stalled in Tassie? Moreover, why is it that a constituent who runs his business from his home in Ferntree still can't connect to the NBN even though he's only 60 metres from a node? And why are small business owners in urban areas like Moona being quoted $5,000, $10,000 or even $20,000 to upgrade from fibre to the node to fibre to the premises when NBN infrastructure is already very close?
The member for McEwen is warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
I might just remind the technological geniuses on the other side that the network which is being used by the NBN in my electorate, where I live and where the honourable member for Maribyrnong lives, is in fact copper. That's what HFC is made out of, just letting you know. It's copper cables. It's called coaxial cable, and it has copper running down it. So just a little pickup for you. Now, Mr Speaker, turning to Tasmania, as the honourable member already has highlighted, the NBN is almost completely rolled out. There are over 267,000 premises ready to connect, and 161,000 premises have an active NBN connection already. It's a far cry from the situation we inherited in late 2013, where the NBN rollout in Tasmania was a complete mess. The lead contractor, Vision Stream, had down tools, notwithstanding the brief interlude of the honourable member for Grayndler as Communications Minister. It wasn't enough to save the NBN from the Conrovian experiment. But, Mr Speaker, there are only 7,000 fixed-line premises in Tasmania ever connected under the former Labor government, despite the rollout kicking off in that state in 2010. Now, in the honourable member's electorate, the rollout is essentially complete. I'm advised there are just 266 connections to go, and to date 71% of the premises in his electorate have connected to the NBN, which is a great result. That's almost 60,000 premises in Denison able to connect to the NBN. Now, he's raised an issue about a particular constituent, and his office has provided details of that constituent, and the NBN is in touch with the constituent today to see what how the problem that's been reported to him can be addressed. In terms of the prices quoted by NBN under technology choice, they simply reflect the real-world costs of rolling out more expensive technologies to a particular premise. The reality is the NBN, as delivered by my government, as delivered by the coalition, is getting built far sooner, many years sooner, and tens of billions of dollars more affordable.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Parkes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on action the coalition government is taking to deliver job-creating infrastructure in rural and regional Australia, and is he aware of any alternatives?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. He is a fine member. He represents an electorate which is more than 393,000 square kilometres, Mr Speaker. He rather unkindly sometimes refers to other electorates as mere horse paddocks, Mr Speaker. Certainly it's the largest electorate in New South Wales, Mr Speaker. And as a proud member and as a strong advocate for regional issues, Mr Speaker, I know he understands the importance of getting on with the job of investing in vital nation-building infrastructure. He knows that this infrastructure creates local jobs and fuels local economies. And that's why, Mr Speaker, that's why this side of the House is investing in small and medium enterprises such that we're enabling them to create jobs. 403,000, as the Prime Minister mentioned a little earlier on, just last year, Mr Speaker, 1,100 jobs a day, and, Mr Speaker, many of them were full-time jobs. The member for Parkes and I are from regional Australia, and we're proud of it, Mr Speaker. Our areas, Mr Speaker, stretch from the north of New South Wales through the west, through the central west and through the Riverina. We know our farmers will benefit from this government's investment in inland rail, Mr Speaker. Construction will start in coming months on the first section of the inland rail from Parkes to Narromine, with the inland rail delivering more than $480 million in economic benefit to the Central West region alone, just the Central West, Mr Speaker. Now, on the 15th of January this year, the member for Parkes, the member for New England and I were at Peak Hill, where the first lot of steel was dropped off to start this
iconic project, Mr Speaker. 600 tonnes of steel being delivered on this historic day. And, Mr Speaker, just to give you an idea of the enormity of the Inland Rail project, it's going to use enough steel to build 5 Sydney Harbour bridges. 5 Sydney Harbour bridges. That's impressive. We know that the small businesses supporting our farmers in these regional communities will benefit from the economic growth the rail line will bring. $10 billion for the construction of the Inland Rail, Mr Speaker. It is the Commonwealth's largest rail project in 100 years. Largest rail project by the Commonwealth in 100 years, thanks to a Liberal Nationals government. Wouldn't have happened under those opposite, Mr Speaker. Would not have happened. We know that increasing economic activity leads to jobs growth, new opportunities and more money in hard-working Australians' pockets. I promise that all those farmers, all those small business people out there working hard to get ahead, that this government has their back. This government has their back. But what do those opposite want to do? They want to jack up taxes. They do. They want to destroy jobs, Mr Speaker. They want to back the CFMEU in all the way, Mr Speaker. But don't take my word for it, Mr Speaker. Just look at the front page of the Australian today, Mr Speaker, and that's where Labor and the CFMEU deal is writ large, Mr Speaker.
I inform the House we also have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Alan Ferguson, former President of the Senate, who's just joined us. On behalf of the House, we're going to extend a warm welcome to you. And I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. This morning, the former Deputy Prime Minister, the member for New England, refused to rule out a return to the job. How long does the current Deputy Prime Minister plan to stay in his role?
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, clearly that is a question that is out of order. It doesn't ask about the responsibilities of the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure. It is purely a political
smear, on my left.
A political smear dressed as a question, and it shouldn't be allowed to be asked.
I'm happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business, but I don't think the question's in order at all.
Speaker?
Take some time, yep, that's your time. Go for it.
There have been constant occasions when a minister has been asked whether they will resign, whether they will continue in their role. Now, unusually, they don't normally get asked this on the second day in the job.
The Manager of Opposition Business can resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition can resume his seat. You can see how clear I was in my ruling. Clearly, I don't agree with those previous rulings. So now we've cleared that up. Let's move to the next question. The member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation. Will the minister outline what threats exist to the delivery of long-term job creation in the economy, and how is the government ensuring that business thrive and help grow the economy?
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wright for his question. The member for Wright knows, Mr Speaker, that the government in the last 12 months has created 403,000 new jobs in this economy, almost 80% of which are full-time jobs. It is a tremendous achievement, and with 16 consecutive months of net jobs growth, we are well on track to pass 1 million new jobs in the 5-year time period that the member for Warringah promised in 2013 when we were first elected. We are ahead of schedule in creating those 1 million jobs. We are almost there, Mr Speaker. It is a real achievement of this government. But I was asked by the member for Wright about threats to this job creation model to a growing economy. And sadly, the left of the Labor Party have recently published a manifesto, Mr Speaker, a manifesto that calls for higher and new taxes, softer border protection so we can return to the bad old days of the Labor government, but even worse than that, empowering the CFMEU, giving more power to the unions on work sites, Mr Speaker. Now, usually we could dismiss the left because they don't have the power in the ALP. It's usually being held by the right wing. But sadly, the left are growing in their power, Mr Speaker, and are threatening to take over the National Conference this year. So their manifesto has to be taken very seriously. And worse than that, they are threatening the Shadow Minister for Defence, who I very much care about, Mr Speaker, as my shadow ministerial opponent, Mr Speaker. He is apparently a right-wing power broker. Now, I know that strains credulity. It strains credulity. The Mr Nice Guy of the front bench is apparently a knife-wielding factional warrior. My strong advice to him, I really suggest, because I want him to stay safe, is stay away from butter knife-wielding state ALP members of Parliament, Mr Speaker, or carry his own butter knife. If he carries his own butter knife, Mr Speaker, in a fast-moving butter knife fight, I would back the member for Corio, because in spite of his looks, he's quite fast-moving. He's quite fast-moving. I believe people underestimate the member for Corio, Mr Speaker. In a fast-moving butter knife fight, I'm backing the member for Corio. But more seriously, I do digress, Mr Speaker. The second great threat to this job-creating model is, of course, the Leader of the Opposition himself. At the Oakey mine protest, he said to the CFMEU he would rip up the industrial relations laws in this country, Mr Speaker. He wants the CFMEU to have more power. He wants the CFMEU not only to make the donations to the ALP, the pre-selection decisions, the policy decisions, he wants to rip up the IR laws and give them more power on the work sites of Australia. The member's time has concluded.
The member for Greenway.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's department said about the NBN connection to his Point Piper mansion, and I quote, "The Prime Minister asked us to make sure it was connected to Point Piper, but our office just had to make sure that everything proceeded smoothly." Can the Prime Minister confirm his department had one discussion with NBN Co and it took just one appointment to get his NBN connection? How is the Prime Minister able to get a speed and service from the NBN that the rest of Australia can only dream of?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Amazing.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her interest in the NBN connections in my electorate. Mr Speaker, the rollout of the NBN over the hybrid fibre coax network, which is built on coaxial cables made of copper, this is a technology. Apparently, this is the premium service that I and 411,000 other customers are receiving. This is one the Labor Party said was second-rate and outdated and should be junked.
Member for
That's
Greenway.
what they said. They can't have it both ways. Now, for more information on the NBN, I'll ask the honourable member, the honourable Minister for Urban Infrastructure, to address the House.
I remind the member for McEwen he's already been warned.
Prime Minister for the opportunity to explore in more detail the question of what Labor's views about the NBN really are, and in particular, what do they think about the HFC, because it seems that Labor has a split personality on the issue of the HFC. The Leader of the Opposition is quoted as saying that Mr Turnbull says that Australian families do not need a first-grade NBN, but he's happy to use one for his own suburb. In other words, he's saying that the Prime Minister is getting first-rate NBN over the HFC, and it is certainly true that the HFC offers a first-rate service, a first-rate broadband service. Now, what does the member for Greenway say on the same topic? Her Facebook page, 11th of February, second-rate HFC. Second-rate HFC. Labor cannot even decide what their views about the HFC are. Is it first-rate, according to the Leader of the Opposition, or is it second-rate, according to the member for Greenway? And of course, if you look at their policy for the 2016 election, what was Labor's policy on the HFC? Under Labor, the rollout of HFC will continue. Well, isn't that interesting? Labor plans to do exactly the same thing with HFC as the Coalition does. But we know the member for Greenway has form on this. Remember, she was the one who claimed that a survey, an Akamai survey about broadband in Kenya, was in some way relevant to be compared to Australia, when there are 200,000 people in Kenya who have a broadband service. And there was another great contribution from that member when she quoted an Ipsos survey which she said finds Australia ranks lowest for broadband satisfaction, that same Ipsos survey, 19% of Australians in that survey rated the current quality of nuclear infrastructure to generate in Australia as very or fairly good. That's the kind of reputable survey that this member is quoting. They'll say anything on the NBN. We're delivering it.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General update the House on the Federal Court's judgment in the case of the Australian Building and Construction Commissioner and the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union? What role do the courts play in maintaining the rule of law, and is the Attorney aware of any alternatives?
The Attorney-General has the floor.
I thank the member for his question, and as the member is well aware, the federal court yesterday levied near maximum fines against the CFMEU for, amongst other things, knowingly making false representations to a worker about the necessity to pay fees to the CFMEU in breach of section 349(1)(a) of the Fair Work Act, threatening to prevent a worker from their lawful right to work on a site with the intent of coercing the worker into industrial activity in breach of section 348. The federal court judge, Mr Speaker, in that case said that the CFMEU had a deplorable record in contravening the law, having contravened industrial law on 135 separate occasions in the last 15 years. The judge also found that the CFMEU condoned the continual breaching of the law. The judge, interestingly, also found that the CFMEU in the 2016 calendar year had revenue of nearly $31 million and net assets valued at $58.5 million, including $9.2 million in cash. And the case dealt, Mr Speaker, with a worker who had not worked for 3 months, was struggling to pay their bills for their family and faced illegal threats designed to prevent him from doing his job and designed to coerce him to pay money to the same union, where the union has $58.5 million in assets. How lucky the workers are to have the CFMEU looking after them in such a professional way. And as the Prime Minister noted, this is, of course, the same union whose representatives made threats against the children of Glencore workers, threats of the most sickening and seriously criminal kind made against children. And I'm asked about alternatives, and there are, of course, alternatives to prosecuting and convicting these types of breaches of the law to provide a deterrence to threats and to coercion. Instead of cutting ties with the union to deter its criminal conduct, you could, for instance, accept large amounts of money from the same union whose business model in raising money is to break the law. And it is notable that in the 16-17 financial year, the ALP accepted in excess of $620,000 from this union. Instead of discouraging lawfulness with clear public statements that it is unacceptable, you could attend a rally and encourage the behaviours by describing the laws being broken as a cancer. But perhaps the most remarkable thing in here is that the alternative of the Leader of the Opposition exhibits all of the trademark hypocrisy that he has become known for.
Will resume his seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Earlier, without saying who he was talking about, the Attorney-General has now referred directly to the Leader of the Opposition. Understanding Order 68, he's referring specifically to a claim that the Leader of the Opposition supports particular conduct and statements that have been made by people.
Members on my right. No. Member for Brisbane.
Understanding Order 68, when the issue has been specifically dealt with by personal explanation, there is an opportunity for the Speaker to intervene, and I ask that you do so.
Okay. Well, I'm very familiar, obviously, with this terrain, and I'll take a little bit of time of the House to explain my approach on this. The former Speaker gave a comprehensive ruling on this matter back near the beginning of the last parliament, because the standing order to which the Manager of Opposition Business refers to was introduced back then at the beginning of that parliament. The former Speaker rightly pointed out a number of things. It was a lengthy ruling. I won't go through every aspect of it. She quite rightly pointed out, in my view, that this additional standing order posed challenges for the Speaker, one in balancing free speech, also with a misrepresentation being repeated. And she adopted a number of principles which I've said previously in the House I abide by. Number one, the claim would have to be of the exact nature, again, and I am listening very carefully, and in this folder I have many things, including previous personal explanations. It would have to be of the exact nature, and I was listening very carefully to the answer. It would then need to be raised by the member affected, that is the member, and that would be the Leader of the Opposition, who made the personal explanation. The Speaker would need to be aware of exactly what was said and for it to be an exact replication. And even after all that, Standing Order 68, I've got the page open here, says the Speaker may intervene. Now, I'm listening very closely. I'm very conscious that prior to the introduction of this standing order, the Speaker could not intervene. I'm very conscious that that is something that the House has decided to include in the standing orders to give the Speaker that option. I'm just going to say to the Attorney-General, I'm listening very closely. He hasn't exactly met the threshold, but I've taken the time of the House for any subsequent answers to questions to make that matter clear. The Attorney-General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the question is, if you go to a rally like that and describe the laws being broken as a cancer, are you discouraging or encouraging the breaking of those laws? And the ultimate hypocrisy here is they were laws introduced by Labor.
The member for Bendigo.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Nola is a 77-year-old that lives in my electorate and recently connected to the Prime Minister's copper NBN. NBN has run a copper cable across her yard, through the bushes and under her bedroom window. Nola was told to be careful when mowing to avoid cutting the cable. When the Prime Minister has a premium speed NBN connection, why should people like Nola have to suffer with his inept copper NBN?
The Minister for Infrastructure has Minister for the member for Greenway. The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for her question. Well, once again, she's drawing a contrast with the HFC, which is, as we've consistently said, a first-rate form of broadband, and Labor seems to be complaining that the HFC is able to deliver a speed of 100 megabits per second, as it is, I'm pleased to say, for the Prime Minister and for many thousands of other customers. 411,000 HFC customers, many of them able to access, all of them able to access, and many of them choosing to access 100 megabits per second. It does raise the question, what is Labor's plan for the NBN? What is Labor's plan for the NBN? Because we really have no idea. In the 2016 election campaign, we know that despite their heated rhetoric now, they stated that they intend to continue with the HFC rollout. They also claimed that they were going to deliver an additional—
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. Point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. On a point of order of direct relevance, the example that's been given is one of a copper cable. It is not an HFC connection. The Minister's entire answer has been about different technology to what the question is about.
Members on my right will cease interjecting. I'm going to call the Minister, but I'll consider the first part of his answer. Okay, well, look, I'm not going to be interrupted when I'm making a ruling. The member for Lindsay will leave under 94A. No, we'll just wait till the member for Lindsay leaves. I'm calling the Minister, but his preamble has come to an end.
I make the point to the House that policy in this area needs to determine the appropriate mix of HFC, fibre to the premises, fibre to the node, fibre to the curb, and that is what the Turnbull government has been focused on, so we can roll this out for $30 billion less and more quickly, getting the whole network delivered by 2020. Now, what we also know about a number of instances that have been raised by Labor in the past is that on investigation, the facts have turned out not to be as claimed. Of course, we will go back and have a look at this claim and we will respond. But I do make the point, we are delivering a network more quickly than Labor could have delivered it for $30 billion less, some 7.4 million premises now in ready-for-services areas. When Labor left government, barely 50,000 premises connected to the fixed network. We now have 7.4 million able to connect, and we have no idea what Labor's policy will be at the next election. And the question the Australian people are entitled to ask is, what is Labor going to do? Because what they promised at the last election, they claimed they were going to roll out 2 million more fibre premises and cost not $1 more. Not $1 more. Magic. That is magic pudding economics. That is a completely implausible, utterly incredible claim, and there's no doubt that the member for Blaxland is deeply relieved not to be the shadow minister anymore, so he doesn't have to defend that particular ridiculous policy.
The minister's time's concluded. The member for Moreton has left under Standing Order 94A. He'd been warned a number of times. When he saw me, he walked. I'm just making sure it's right for the record. And I'll call the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the steps the government is taking to protect Australian interests from the threat of terrorism in our region?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Tangney for his question. Yesterday I informed the House of the success to date in the fight against the terrorist organisation ISIS, and it is a fact that ISIS has now lost about 98%, almost all of the territory it once controlled in Syria and Iraq. However, we still do face threats from ISIS and other terrorist organisations, the fighters, the propagandists, the supporters, and we're particularly concerned about returning foreign terrorist fighters. So tracking and monitoring their movements remains one of our highest priorities. Mr Speaker, it is a fact that we are working very closely with our intelligence partners, key allies and partners in the region, particularly tracking those foreign terrorist fighters that we believe are coming back to this part of the world. I can inform the House that we believe about 220 Australians were in the conflict zone in Syria and Iraq. About half of them have been killed. Some of them have returned to Australia and are being monitored. Some of them are being prosecuted. We believe that about 110 remain in the Middle East, and we are working with partners to keep tracking their movements and monitoring their whereabouts. Mr Speaker, I can also say that our intelligence agencies believe that about 70 children are in the Middle East. They have been taken there by the terrorist fighters, and tragically we believe that they are still there. Now, Mr Speaker, our regional partners are deeply concerned about the number of families that are in the conflict zone. We share their concerns. Imagine the trauma that some of these women and children have suffered, but also, disturbingly, there are more women involved than ever before in supporting terrorists and their activities. So, Mr Speaker, we are working very closely with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with the Philippines to share information, to share intelligence and to counter terrorism however we can. And I can report to the House that, as Foreign Minister, I have cancelled about 230 passports of Australians that we believe pose a national security threat and were seeking to join the terrorist organisation ISIS or affiliates in the Middle East. Now, we are keeping these people here so that they can remain under surveillance, under monitoring, and ensure that they don't go over to the Middle East, take up with the terrorist organisation and become experienced terrorist fighters. Mr Speaker, this government places the security of Australians as at one of our highest priorities and will continue to fight terrorism both at home and abroad.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Senator Fifield has claimed that the Prime Minister's copper NBN is, and I quote, the envy of the world. Given that the Prime Minister is personally responsible for the highest level of internet complaints on record, a $20 billion cost blowout, a copper network that can't deliver the speeds that Australians want or need, isn't it clear that the only thing that the Prime Minister has achieved is to make the internet speeds of Point Piper the envy of the rest of Australia?
The Prime Minister has
Well, I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for demonstrating his enthusiasm for his politics of envy, his phony class war. And it reminds me, Mr Speaker, of the address he gave to the CFMEU workers at Oakey. And, you know, there he was saying the Fair Work Commission that his government, the Labor government, had established was a cancer that had to be excised, and he was backing those striking CFMEU members in there when it went right at the time when they were threatening other Glencore workers with violence against their children. That was the company he was keeping, the people he was backing. And of course, winding up, he was there with the member for Gorton, and he said, "I thank you for inviting Brendan and I. I'm spewing to see you in these difficult circumstances," he said. I think the only spewing that would have gone on was to see the Leader of the Opposition in his fake sort of man of the people, horny-handed son of toil,
Prime Minister
workers'
resume his
champion.
seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Speaker, on point of order on direct relevance. While I appreciate
Could the
question,
Manager of Opposition Business just pause for a second? Could those on my right cease interjecting, including the Leader of the House? And can the Manager of Opposition Business start his point of order?
Thanks, Speaker. On direct relevance, while a question like this always does give a wider scope in the answer, we've gone completely beyond the policy topic in the Prime Minister's answer and well away from anything that could be even considered vaguely relevant to the question.
Just before, I'm going to rule on the point of order, if that's okay. And I am going to say, as I've said before, that the Prime Minister, indeed other ministers, are entitled to compare and contrast. The Prime Minister, for a period there, linked a word in the question and made an observation with respect to the word envy, which he's entitled to do. But I do agree with the Manager of Opposition Business that the Prime Minister now needs to come back to the policy topic. Now he's compared and contrasted.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'll just conclude with some information from the NBN. The average speed across the fibre to the node part of the NBN is almost 70 megabits per second. 80% of users take up a 12 megabit per second or 25 megabit per second plan. I'd remind honourable members opposite that coaxial cable is made out of copper, and so the coaxial cable that goes into premises in HFC areas has been there for a very long time. It's what the honourable member for Greenway recently described as being second-rate. It is a copper technology, and where it is available, which is currently at 1.4 million premises, it can offer a speed of 100 megabits per second. Regrettably, not enough people take that up. The NBN would be very grateful for the extra revenue. I'd also say, Mr Speaker, in reference to the question from the member for Denison, I'm sorry he's not here, the member for Denison's constituent that he referred to in Fern Tree, I'm advised by the NBN that they have just called him and advised him his premises are ready for service.
The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on steps the coalition government has taken to protect Australian families from dangerous visa holders? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Proud of the fact that the government has a very strong policy on cancelling the visas of non-citizens, people who are in our country as tourists, as guests, as workers, and those that commit crimes against Australians can expect to have their visas cancelled. And in fact, under this government, Mr Speaker, we have cancelled some 3,300 visas of dangerous non-citizens, and Australians are safer because of it. Mr Speaker, it is a stark contrast, not only in this area but also, of course, in the area of border protection, where Labor was weak as well in that area of public policy. And we know that we have cancelled more visas of dangerous criminals who are in our country in the last 3 months than Labor did in their first 3 years in government. Now, Mr Speaker, of the 3,300, we've cancelled the visas of 135 rapists, 260 child sex offenders and 170 members of outlaw motorcycle gangs. Now, as we've reported to the House before, the cancellation of the outlaw motorcycle gang members has not been welcomed by all Australians, because, as we know, the CFMEU, the most militant union in the country, employs the services of outlaw motorcycle gang members, because the outlaw motorcycle gang members aren't only involved in the distribution of ice and amphetamines around the country, they aren't only involved in extortion with shop owners and families around the country, but they're also engaged in the CFMEU's protection racket on building sites around the country. Now, there's somebody in this House who has a particular connection to the CFMEU, and it is, of course, our old friend, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Now, the CFMEU has donated tens of millions of dollars to the Labor Party. We see in today's Australian story by Simon Benson, where he details the involvement, again, the encouragement through the words of the Leader of the Opposition of those lawless thugs involved in the CFMEU. We know that members of outlaw motorcycle gangs have now infiltrated themselves into the union movement, the CFMEU, and it seems that the Leader of the Opposition has learnt not only how to take money from the CFMEU, but
the
also—
The Minister will just pause for a second. He can't make a claim that the Leader of the Opposition has taken money from the CFMEU.
Well, I made the reference to the donations before, Mr Speaker, and I withdraw the personal inference. I'm sure that has never taken place. I mean, this person is of impeccable character. I have no doubt. I mean, he has conducted his entire adult life. He's been involved in a number of affairs across his adult life. He's broken trust with so many people across his adult life, Mr Speaker. There are many members behind him who have been double-crossed by this Leader of the Opposition. There are many people involved in the union movement, involved in the Labor Party, who cannot trust a word that this Leader of the Opposition says. And you know what, Mr Speaker? The Australian public has formed the same judgment.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of reports that a consortium led by Pacific Blue Capital, a company run by his mate Scott Briggs, will bid for a $1 billion contract to privatise the government's visa processing system? Given it's reported the Prime Minister launched Pacific Blue Capital and that Mr Briggs worked for the Prime Minister's private investment firm, does the Prime Minister have a conflict of interest in relation to this $1 billion government contract, and if so, how will he manage it?
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, that question is just a slur and a smear against the Prime Minister. He has absolutely no responsibility.
Leader of the House, resume his seat. Leader of the House, resume his seat. Members on my left will cease interjecting. I don't know how many times I have to repeat myself. I need to hear the Leader of the House. Is entitled to be heard, just as the manager of opposition business is entitled to be heard. If this persists, I will just lower the temperature rapidly through ejections. Now, I'd like the Leader of the House to raise his point of order and I need to be able to hear him. The Leader of the House, if he could
Thank you, Mr.
start
Speaker.
again, because I only heard every second word.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is a slur and a smear masquerading as a question. The Prime Minister has no responsibility for public tenders and other ministers' portfolios, and therefore he couldn't possibly have any knowledge of the answer to that question.
The member for Bruce will leave under 94A. And anyone else who wants to join him, speak now. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Just to the point of order.
Yep.
There are two parts to the question, Speaker. Whether the Prime Minister has a conflict of interest, and if so, how does he manage it? The other information is provided only to the extent that it's necessary to make sense of the question.
In ruling on this question, there are aspects of the question that I think are out of order, but not of the volume we had yesterday. And the Prime Minister, as other ministers do under the practice, has every option to answer the question himself or refer it to another minister if they so wish. So it's close to the line, but I am going to allow the question to proceed. The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that my department is in a tender process. At the moment, the normal probity arrangements are in place. The Prime Minister, myself, we are not decision makers in relation to this particular tender, and it's the case with tenders across the Commonwealth that they are dealt with by the appropriate officers within the respective departments in relation to this matter, in relation to my own department, and all of the normal procedures will be followed, and that is an issue for the departments, as the Leader of the Opposition well knows. But I'll say one thing, Mr. Speaker. We are not going to take a morals lecture from this man. Not on this topic, not on any topic, Mr. Speaker. We are not going to take a lecture on morals from this man in relation to
The Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition did not ask the question. The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Business, the Workplace and Deregulation. Will the minister update the House on bargaining at the Oakey Creek mine and outline steps the government has been taking in order to encourage the parties to reach agreement? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Small Business has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for Capricornia for her question, and I want to thank her, the Minister for Resources in Northern Australia, the member for Dawson and the member for Flynn in particular. And I am pleased to inform the House that next Monday, Mr. Speaker, the workers at Oakey Creek will head back into the mine. And that is a great result, and I would like to thank the role that the Fair Work Commission has played in that, but in particular in thanking the member for Capricornia, the member for Dawson, the member for Flynn and the Minister of Resources in Northern Australia. I'd like to thank them for the opportunity they have provided me with meeting with local CFMEU delegates in the last couple of weeks, as well as the company Glencore involved. In the last couple of weeks, Mr. Speaker, I have met with both sides of this dispute on several occasions, as have they, and we have urged the parties to come together and bargain in good faith, an approach that I hope, in whatever time I have in this portfolio, to attack it with, to bring both sides together and find a constructive solution. And on Monday, this lockout will end after near 7 months. And I'm asked, are there any alternates? Just last night, we found out all about Labor's secret plan, the plan that has been constructed by Sally McManus and the ACTU, in which the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Gorton are going to rip up their own Fair Work Act, the result of their legislation imposed, drafted between 2007 and implemented mid-2009, that they have stood behind and all said magnificently proud things of. Why? Because, as the member for Gorton said this morning, the system's broken. The nuclear factor, which is what Sally McManus refers to, terminating agreements, in the last 12 months, 3% of the agreements terminated have been contested. 97% have been done by mutual consent. And what does this look like, this broken system? This week, Olivia, a Year 10 student, and her mother took the action in the Commission against the yogurt factory and their enterprise agreement. And they beat the company, had it contested and had it dismissed. Why? Because the conditions in that had become to a stage where they needed to be updated. A Year 10 student and her mother used the system as it was designed. This system is not broken. It is being manipulated by the ACTU and the left of the Labor Party as they dictate to the member for Gorton and the Leader of the Opposition. They swallow it hook, line and sinker. Why? Because they are interested in union power in the workplace. Nothing more and nothing less. What will be the result? The decimation of this economy, a loss of jobs. Again, not one policy that will create one job, only policies that decimate the economy. You put this mob in charge, you will pay the price.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs, and I refer to his previous answer and to reports that a consortium led by Pacific Blue Capital will bid for a $1 billion contract to privatise the government's visa processing system. Does the Minister for Home Affairs have a conflict of interest in relation to this $1 billion government contract, given the minister's former senior advisor is now Director of Special Projects at Pacific Blue Capital? If so, how will this conflict be managed?
The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House, the Minister for Home Affairs, has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. In any open tender process, anybody is able to make application or to submit a tender for that work, unless the opposition is suggesting that people should be excluded on a particular basis. Then they need to put that forward to articulate that. I don't think that's what they're suggesting. I think, Mr Speaker, this is more to do with some sort of smear campaign to try and push back against what we have raised legitimately in this question time today, Mr Speaker, in relation to this Leader of the Opposition and questions about his character, Mr Speaker. That's what I think this is about. This is more about some sort of deflection from the criticism rightly levelled at this Leader of the Opposition during question time today.
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Isaacs on a point of order.
Yes, the point of order is direct relevance. None of what the minister is saying has anything to...
The minister has the call. He's finished his answer. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on the importance of creating economic conditions that help to grow the economy and reduce the tax burden on hard-working Australians? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Chisholm for her question, and I note her strong family history and her background in small business. Like the member, the government knows that the best way to improve the prosperity of Australians is to create the right economic settings to allow them to invest, to grow jobs and to make sure that they create wealth. It was on this basis that, of course, the government provided tax relief for more than 3 million Australians, middle-income Australians who are doing it tough, and we have reduced taxes for small and medium-sized businesses who employ more than half of Australia's private sector workforce. And the government's policies have well and truly borne fruit. We have seen more than 1,100 jobs created every single day in 2017, and we have also seen the longest run of monthly jobs growth ever recorded, and, pleasingly, female workforce participation has climbed to its highest level on record. Now, those opposite, sadly, do not support the government's plans for growth and prosperity. They believe that instead of growing the pie, you should tax it further and further into oblivion. And it's very sad. It used to be, Mr Speaker, it used to be that Paul Keating was the standard-bearer for the Labor Party's economic credentials, but since then they have absolutely gone backwards. They have gone back to the member for Lilly, then to the member for McMahon, and now it was revealed only this week that the member for Scullin and the member for Shortland have assumed the role of the new Labor Economic Brains Trust. Not content with the $164 billion worth of new taxes that their leader has already proposed, we have seen reports this week that the Labor Party would pile even more taxes, even more new taxes onto the Australian economy. Now, if I can quote the dynamic duo, these taxes, such as but not limited to the Buffett tax and the Tobin tax. Now, I wonder where in the world did they get inspiration for these ideas? How about the left-wing ideologue Bernie Sanders, for starters, who proposed an extra $15 trillion worth of new taxes? Now, that's something to aspire to. Or how about, and I know that the Leader of the Opposition will particularly like this one, Jeremy Corbyn, the radical UK Labor leader, who is on record as saying we must work to bring in a financial transactions tax. Now, Mr Speaker, the contrast could not be clearer. The Turnbull government, we stand for jobs, we stand for lower taxes, we stand for greater prosperity for all Australians.
Concluded. The member for Chifley.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Workplace. It's been nearly 2 years since an 18-year-old tragically lost his life on a Work for the Dole project in Toowoomba. Since then, we've had reports of Work for the Dole participants exposed to asbestos. Internal audits have revealed 36% of Work for the Dole sites fail to meet departmental safety expectations. Why has the Turnbull government refused to tell the public the concrete steps it's taking to improve workplace safety for young Australians in the Work for the Dole program?
The Minister for Small Business and the Workplace has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Obviously, any workplace tragedy is one workplace tragedy too many, and I think that would be a consistent view right across the House. The Work for the Dole scheme, which was reintroduced upon the election of us in the 2013 election campaign, is a centrepiece component of the philosophy that we have on this side of the House. The best form of welfare is a job. We have had a raft of policies that are consistent with that theme. The most recent that I spoke about in this chamber is the Youth Jobs Path program. The results of that are fast approaching its first anniversary. Are nearly 70% of the people involved in the internship program have achieved employment. When it comes to the youth program, the result is somewhere around 63%. I spoke last week about the member for McMillan.
The minister will resume his seat. The member for Chifley. No, might be quicker if you just take a temporary one closer to the dispatch box. The member for Chifley on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, I think a serious question deserves direct relevance.
I thank the member for Chifley. The minister is in order.
I can assure the member for Chifley I take workplace safety extremely seriously. I had, as I have stated many times, 23 years pre-politics, implementing work health and safety procedures and practices, which all employers, irrespective of whether in the public or private sector, should do. And I was in the process of explaining that these procedures and policies should always be taken seriously by all workplaces. We have, as I said, on this side of the House, implemented policies, and those interject opposite. I know you don't like them because I've read many of your quotes, but the results of these policies are serious economic and employment results. Yes, the onus on every employer in this country under the Work Health and Safety Act, above all other acts in this country, is the safety of their employees, and they should at all times have this front and centre of mind as they formulate their own policies and procedures under that Act, train their staff and implement them for it.
The member for Bowman.
Yep, thanks, Speaker. A question to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on the government's commitment to roll out measures that help welfare recipients struggling with substance abuse to get off drugs and into work? And how does this compare with alternative approaches?
The Minister for Social Services has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his question and note his advocacy for getting people off welfare and into work. I know it's been a passion of his since he's been in this place. The Coalition knows that the best form of welfare is a job. However, research has consistently shown that one of the worst barriers to getting a job is substance abuse. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's 2016 National Drug Strategy Household Survey shows that illicit drug use was more prevalent among the unemployed than employed people. Those who were unemployed were 3.1 times more likely to use methamphetamines and 1.5 times more likely to use cannabis. This is why tomorrow the government will introduce measures that will trial drug testing for new welfare recipients in 3 locations across Australia. If this bill passes, the trial will be rolled out to Logan in Queensland, Canterbury Bankstown in New South Wales and Mandurah in Western Australia. The trial is not about taking away payments for those who test positive. This is about helping those people with a problem get treatment, help them help themselves and then get a job. People who are part of the trial and test positive to illicit drugs would have access to treatment and rehabilitation to assist them in getting a job. This is about helping them help themselves into a job. For those people who are medically assessed as having substance abuse issues that will prevent them from getting a job, their treatment will be included in their mutual obligation for welfare payments. We have put in place measures that will safeguard the vulnerable, including people who might also be the victims of domestic violence or homelessness. We are willing to try new measures and tackle drug abuse and ensure taxpayer money is aimed at getting people off welfare and into work. And I say to those opposite, this is a trial. We encourage you to work with us. We want to help these people. We want to make sure that the 1,100 jobs that are being created a day, that these people can benefit from that jobs growth, that they can be part of the successful economy that we are now seeing. This is an opportunity to help those, especially the long-term unemployed, to benefit from the 1,100 jobs we are creating a day.
The Prime Minister has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.